Well, hello, and thank you for inviting me to this 5th International Conference on Communications and Media Studies. The special focus theme of this 2020 conference is provocatively entitled A Pandemic of Misinformation, Truth in Bubbles. And we've been asked to reflect on how in the current media environment, with its proliferation of misinformation, we can hope to provide accurate, authoritative information to the public in the fight against a global pandemic, and more specifically, perhaps, how governments can provide public health directives to a population that population will actually comply with. While in the mid-20th century, the mainstream media was able to monopolize a broad audience and manufacture consent among a population, as Noam Chomsky would say, my contention in this talk is that the social project in the 21st century must be to manufacture consensus. This will not be an easy task in the fragile civic space that we now find ourselves in. And I'd like to start this talk by telling you a couple of short stories. I live in Canada, as you may know, and public health authorities here have done a pretty good job of setting policy and getting people to comply in this pandemic, but in no way has it all been perfect. In Canada as elsewhere, we've experienced the swirl of changing information, conflicting policy viewpoints, the evolving science, and the revised and sometimes conflicting public health directives. And at the end of this summer, I had an old friend and her husband come to visit us from another province and stay with us in our small apartment, which was probably a public health risk, but they'd been planning the visit for years, and I took precautions. I was alarmed when Tracy described herself as an anti-vaxxer. And when I pressed her, she explained that it takes 20 years to develop a safe, effective vaccine. And she refused simply to have her family be the guinea pigs for any new vaccine for COVID-19. Earlier in the summer, another friend was over for dinner with her husband, and he was about to have major surgery and was at special risk if he got the coronavirus. So of course I took elaborate precautions. But over the course of the dinner, Ellen asserted that the risk was in fact very low, that death rates around the world were no greater than usual with influenza, the regular death rates that we saw with influenza. And Ellen, by the way, is the CEO of a large public health agency that focuses on the drug addicted and the homeless in Vancouver. So I searched up a New York Times study that I'd seen that showed statistically significant rises in death rates in countries around the world since the outbreak of the pandemic, tending to show that the coronavirus was responsible. And I asked, aren't you concerned about the virus ripping through the homeless population? This was something that our public radio had been predicting, simply on the basis that this population has difficulty social distancing and even finding places to wash their hands. And she told me there were 0 COVID infections among the Lower East Side population to that date. 0. So I tell these stories, and I'm sure you have your own, simply to illustrate the Tower of Babel that we're constructing and trying to live in together now. Concerned citizens, we are each reading and acquiring information voraciously, and all the while becoming more and more differently informed. As my 15-year-old native son told me when I was writing my book, Coding Democracy, we are all in our own bubbles now. So I grew up in the mid-20th century during the heyday of mainstream media and experienced firsthand how mainstream media spoke to a broad audience and to a large degree manufactured consent among the population. And as this audience would certainly know, In the mid-20th century, the mainstream media monopolized a scarce resource, radio and television waves, and it had a commercial incentive to try to capture the broadest audience possible. Its reporting was presented as objective, and people consumed more or less the same information and the messages, same messages from it. So if people were manipulated into consenting to established power structures and conventional viewpoints, they were manipulated together. There was little access to alternative viewpoints, and it was relatively easy to get the public to cooperate in public health or drug campaigns. Those of you who also grew up in the 50s and 60s will remember the eradication of polio and the use of thalidomide by pregnant women for morning sickness. The mainstream media manufactured consent. It was no guarantor of good policy. Now today, the entire media sphere is fragmented. The audience for mainstream media itself is almost entirely divided. A recent Pew study showed that 93% of the people who say Fox is their primary news source describe themselves as Republicans. And meanwhile, 95% of MSNBC viewers are Democrats, as are 91% of New York Times readers. And then when you add our news feeds and our online consumption of alternate news sources, you get not merely a divided information environment, but a chaotic one. There is no longer 2 nightly channels for news in every household, reporting more or less the same thing, and trusted figures like Walter Cronkite comforting us with collective good nights in a nice, calm, paternal voice. Rather, we have a world of narrowcasting. Media companies now make most of their money targeting smaller and smaller slices of the population, and by pumping up these audiences' engagement by stirring up fear and anger. We're in a world of political micro-targeting, and of course the great scandal of Brexit and the 2016 US election was the revelation that Cambridge Analytica and its partner company were able to scrape the personal information of Facebook users in order to micro-target them on an industrial scale with tailored political messages, often conflicting messages, but you can speak out of both sides of your mouth when you're sending these messages individually. And to compound that scandal, we realized that the Obama campaign had done a similar kind of scraping of Facebook and targeting in the 2008 election. We're living in a world of geopolitical disinformation campaigns. And while Russia still leads in terms of the extent and sophistication of its disinformation operations, it's estimated that around 70 countries are now participating in these kinds of operations now, including China, which has recently been stepping up its game. We're living in a world of deep fakes, and this is perhaps the most potent disinformation tool yet. And that by deep fakes, I mean not merely tampering with visual imagery, with photo touch tools, but in fact, synthetic media that is wholly or partially generated by AI. That is highly believable fake visual or audio at a scale that we have not experienced before. The ability to take a person's biometric data and create an audio or video clip from whole cloth. So we're just at the start of this tech revolution, and there are predictions that by the next American election, 4 years from now, there may be up to 90% of synthetic media. What is online may be up to 90% synthetic media. And that's quite an alarming development, and something that every state, business, and individual will need to be trying to protect themselves against. But even more disturbingly, I would say, we are living in a world where Western leaders seem to be embracing increasingly a deliberate strategy of inducing information dysphoria in their populations. And perhaps the most insightful take on this development comes from a historian of the 20th century, Timothy Snyder, who you may recall is the author of that short book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. According to Snyder, Americans need to understand that the Russians didn't merely hack the last US election. More insidiously, the authoritarian philosophy and methods of the Russian regime have been migrating to the West and are being employed by Western politicians and their supporters, most prominently the Trump campaign. And Snyder, who has studied in Russia over long periods and reads the daily newspapers there, has said that the Russian government's tactic of inducing information dysphoria was honed on its own population before it was exported. And what it is meant to do is really to maintain a kind of political equilibrium in which the Russian population is induced to tolerate as much as possible a state of oligarchy and radical inequality. And these conditions are stabilized and institutionalized in Russia, Snyder says, by a very steady, efficiently, and beautifully produced diet of fake news, complemented by a series of manufactured triumphs abroad. This is a certain model. You fill the public sphere with things that aren't true, and you contradict yourself all the time. And then you blame journalists, the people who are responsible for factuality, and you talk about having to crack down on them. And then nobody knows what the truth is anymore. Nobody trusts the media, and you end up having a monopoly, or at least a very strong position in the manufacture of the symbols of the day. And this manufacture of symbols, I would hazard to say, is an appeal directly to people's emotions, to their grievances, to their mythologies of loss and redemption. Emotion or life experience are often what our political beliefs spring from, not facts or logic. And I think if you think honestly how you developed your own political beliefs, at least the ones that you're really passionate about, you'd agree with me. And we're seeing this model at play every day now in the lead up to the 2020 American election and Trump's handling of the current pandemic crisis. He says patently untrue things all the time. He sends mixed messages. He violates public health advice that his own administration gives, holding large events without masks or social distancing. And this, I think it's important to understand, is not mere incompetence, because confusion, demobilization, the stirring up of emotion are regime policy. He's creating a very strong position from which to manufacture the symbols of the day. And authoritarian leaders in other countries are doing the same thing, because if there is no truth, there is only power. Now, of course, democratic societies require a shared belief in factuality, a trust that we can at least agree on the methodology for ascertaining facts, and a belief that facts matter. If you destroy that belief, then you destroy democracy. So, as Snyder would say, that's what 21st century authoritarians have discovered, that this is the cheap and easy way to destroy democracy, and that's the process that we see underway before our eyes now. So, to return to the question posed by this conference theme, how do we remedy a pandemic of disinformation? How do we mount an effective public response commanding the broad compliance of a population? Or as I would put it, what do we need to do to manufacture consensus? Now, you might be surprised, coming from a person like myself, who's written a book on digital tech called Coding Democracy. But I think that the solutions are mostly analog, not tech based. And I would say that first, we need ongoing investment in strong public health institutions that serve the population and build trust over time. This is certainly not an easy fix. It's not a fix that lies with media only, but I think we just can't delude ourselves that there will be easy fixes to this damaged information environment that we now find ourselves in. It is something that requires interdisciplinary thinking and broader thinking than just our narrow fields. So you want to have people trust public health institutions, then build trustworthy public health institutions that actually serve them. That's number one. Second, I think we need a determinedly collaborative versus an authoritarian approach. And that entails clear messaging from public health institutions that respects the intelligence of the population and avoids manipulation at all costs. I think that the manipulation around the wearing of masks early on in the pandemic, when we were told that masks were of no use to the ordinary person, but they seem to be vital for frontline healthcare workers, was obvious manipulation and damaging to authorities' credibility. A collaborative approach entails a frank acknowledgement of uncertainty and of evolving scientific understanding. It entails an appeal to broadly shared values. If we cannot build consensus around principles such as the precautionary principle, which in the United States, it seems that kind of consensus might be beyond reach, perhaps we can build it on more simple values like caring for one's immediate neighbor. A collaborative approach would also allow for some self-determination, that is, some freedom for individuals to choose their own personal level of risk. And beyond that determination to maintain a collaborative approach with the population and eschew an authoritarian one, I think we badly need more media literacy. And that's really humility, humility on the part of all of us about how micro-targeting, narrowcasting, and confirmation bias drag all of us down our personal rabbit holes. We need, in terms of regulation, I think we need a total ban on the micro-targeting of political messages by political parties through platforms like Facebook. I think we also need mechanisms, and this admittedly is a tech solution, mechanisms for verifying the authenticity of facts and sources, if not their truth. In other words, I think we need a vigorous policy response to combat deepfakes before AI dissolves our ability to do so. It appears that this technology is not beyond our reach. There are entities out there now working on it that include Adobe, Qualcomm, BBC, the New York Times, Getty Images. They're investing in it now. But the government needs to invest in it, and it needs to become something that is embedded in our information systems. I think we should avoid creating new surveillance systems. And I've really written 2 books about surveillance. One called Illusions of Security, published by City Lights in 2007, which was an early look at the global infrastructure of surveillance that was then being constructed. And my most recent book for MIT Press, Coding Democracy, which looks at hackers' disruption of authoritarian and systems and mass surveillance. And I think it's become more broadly understood among ordinary citizens how corrosive surveillance is to democracies. So I would say we need to avoid using surveillance systems for COVID tracking and other purposes, because it's very hard to prevent these from becoming entrenched investments and from being used in authoritarian ways. Similarly, we need to avoid using censorship through algorithms. It's very hard to prevent these from becoming opaque and unaccountable, and they will be wielded and developed by the large private platforms like Facebook that are becoming such threats to our shared democratic space. We need public investment in local news. News coverage that tends to knit communities together rather than tear them apart. And this is a no-brainer. We need economic supports and incentives for public health compliance. Incentives like paid sick days, income support, free masks, and the like. And finally, and I can't stress this enough, we need to talk and interact regularly with each other, and especially with people we disagree with. We need a reversal of the trend whereby Americans have largely sorted themselves into staunch blue and red residential districts and social circles. We need, as ordinary citizens, to show up in person or by Zoom and participate with each other in deliberative spaces at all levels of governance and civil society. Manufacturing consensus will take some sustained commitment from each of us to the value of social cohesion. And that concludes my remarks for today. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. I send you all my best wishes.